Yeah, so let me give you a little bit of kind of the origin, and then I'll do the flyover. So I became a Christian hedonist in college. I think I'd actually become one prior to that in high school, not knowing that that's what had happened. I'm pretty sure it was the Psalms that did it. Delight yourself in the Lord as the deer pants for streams of water. Those were the sort of prayers I was praying kind of as a senior in high school into college. And somewhere in there, somebody said, hey, you should listen to this Piper guy. I said, great. I didn't even know you could listen to sermons on the internet. That was a new thing for me. But I did, and it resonated at a very deep level. And so I got all kinds of hyphenated words. I was God-centered, Christ-exalting, Bible-saturated, and everything. You just kept adding to the list, and I was good to go. And so I dove headlong into that and found it to be unbelievably eye-opening as I opened the Bible in new ways and was seeing new things there. And that the mission statement that we all love here at Bethlehem, we exist to spread a passion for the supremacy of God in all things, for the joy of all peoples, through Jesus Christ. That was it. That was what I wanted to be about. And so college was pretty sweet in some ways because it was a very deep, rich time of exploring the Bible with help from Pastor John and then those that Pastor John kind of introduced me to, old dead guys by and large. And so it was good. It was hard. There were some seasons of doubt and depression that kind of sobered me up from that young Calvinist stage that too many of us have gone through. But all is good. So then after college, my wife and I moved up here to be a part of the apprenticeship. And as we did, we just really wanted to see what does a church look like that's built on that kind of foundation, God-centered, Christ-exalting, Bible-saturated, missions-driven, so on and so forth. What does that actually look like in practice? And it's been an unbelievable season for us here, 10 years at Bethlehem, seeing that fleshed out in so many different ways, with some of you, in fact. But through it, like Matt said, there's been some things, some funky things that have kind of emerged both in my own life. Marriage causes all that. There's a great old quote, something like, "Marriage is the great searchlight turned on the darkest corners of your soul." And that's true. So things began to emerge in marriage. Things began to emerge as we were here at Bethlehem. That began to feel not right. Something was a little off. Like this passion for the supremacy of God was going in funny directions in my heart, and I wasn't sure how to resolve it. And so a couple of things happened that helped to resolve it, and is where the book came from. The first was when I was at the Bethlehem Institute, now Bethlehem College and Seminary. I took a class on Jonathan Edwards, and that class was like in the same way that in college, Pastor John had opened up my eyes to a whole different world than I'd been aware of prior to it. This was that kind of same, like it happened again. I didn't know it could happen again. And it's happened a couple of different times since then as well. So Edwards' Trinitarian vision of life, the deep, rich view of God-entranced vision of all things that he embraced was so big and was actually deeper than I'd thought. I hadn't really connected the Trinitarian aspect. And so I've got a chapter in here on the Trinity largely because of that, because I thought I'd missed that, or the fullness of that, or how important that was until then, and that blew it open in new ways. So that was one thing, is this class on Edwards that began to make me think there's ways of thinking about God's passion for his glory beyond even what I'd conceived. Second thing that happened is I started reading a lot of C.S. Lewis, and I started reading a lot of Doug Wilson. And both of those, so there's the influences. I joke in the book that there's 4 streams that come down to water the garden that became this book. One of them outside, all from one source, that's God, but Piper, Edwards, Lewis, Wilson. And that it was the combination of those things over the past probably 5 or 6 years that really began to collect into what came out here. So from Wilson, there was this real earthiness to the way that he writes about things. I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, but there's real earthiness, and that I began to think like that's a little different than what I feel like I'm used to, but it feels like it fits. I got to figure out how it fits. Mm-hmm. And the same thing that happened with Lewis. There was aspects of Lewis that I had never considered before. And so through that, some of these questions like, how do I enjoy my wife, now my kids, my food in such a way that I'm really enjoying them, that I'm not just kind of using them in some kind of means-end way, that they're not really important, and I'm really enjoying God and that's it? How do I really engage with them in such a way that it's honoring to God, but really engaging with them? Like I felt like I was always being pulled in these two different directions. And I felt like because of my God-centeredness, because I embraced that, thought that was biblical, my default was always to feel like if I'm doing this, things are good. Any pull this way felt guilt. And there was just kind of this vague sense of guilt in engaging with anything that was delightful. And so the things like, I feel like I might be enjoying fill in the blank, my wife, my kids, football, too much. Mm-hmm. And it was that too much. Like, what does that mean? Like, there was no concrete definition to that. It was just, I'm enjoying this too much. And if you try to push into that and you say, well, how would you know if you were enjoying it just right? Kind of like three bears, it was too hot, too cold, just right. How do I know just right? And I couldn't answer that question. And so I began to think maybe there's something wrong with the way I'm asking that question. So it's questions like that. It was questions given my finitude, given the fact that I have to sleep, how are you God-centered all the time? How can you be God-centered all the time? How can you do everything to the glory of God? What does that actually look like on the ground? So it's questions like that, and as they began to come together, a couple years ago, I had the privilege of kind of moderating a discussion between Piper and Wilson at a Desiring God conference, and trying to explore this. I was like, you guys are on the same page on so many things, and yet I feel like there's some differences. Let's explore that. And so as I'm doing that, all of a sudden I begin to think like, there it is. That's that thing that's been missing. And it was through that little interview, out of that, basically I walked out of that session. It was a couple hours of fun theological conversation. I had a blast doing it. But it came out of saying, I think that there's a book here on how do we treasure God in the enjoyment of his gifts. And so then one of the great things about being a church-based college and seminary is that you get opportunities to try stuff out. And so I got a chance to teach through basically the content for the book 3 different times over the course of a couple of years. And through that, met some of you and who were saying, yeah, me too. Me too. That's how I feel. I feel that guilt. I feel that stretch that I'm not sure. I feel like I'm holding my created goods, these gifts, like a hot potato. Like I don't want them to get too precious to me. And there can be these weird dislocations in families as, you're never quite engaging fully with each other because you don't want to become too precious. What if God takes them? Mm-hmm. And I don't want them to be too in here, because if God decides in his providence to do a Job on me, I don't want to curse him, and so I won't let things get close. So there was things like that as we talked here at Bethlehem that I was like, okay, and it was good. There was a lot of refining that happened through that. And so those are just some of the things, so it's been a real sweet thing over the past few years to be here at Bethlehem, to experience the grace that God's poured out here, and then to think, I think that we can press forward. And so with that, what actually is the book? So I'm going to actually open the table of contents because this will jog it. So I start where we ought to start, which is with the glory of the triune God. We start with God, and he creates in order to draw us into fellowship with himself. And that's what I didn't get prior. I'd always thought of God as he exists to display his glory, but I didn't realize that display of his glory was actually an invitation. Like, come in, join us. And that's where the Trinity came in. It's the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, knowing each other, loving each other, delighting each other. Come into this. Come enjoy this eternal fellowship that we've had, and we don't need you, but out of joy we've created you, and we want to invite you in. And that was kind of a different picture in my mind, and all of a sudden, different other elements of created life began to make more sense. Like, that's what marriage is about. That's what families are about. That's what churches are about, are little pictures, little examples of that kind of triune fellowship. So I start there. God exists, or God glorifies himself by inviting us into his fellowship. Then I move from there and talk about the author and his story. How does God relate to creation? Well, he's the author. This is his story. The world is his story. We're his characters. And part of the reason I put that in is because authors and characters are so closely related that you can't quite set, like, who killed the White Witch? Well, Aslan killed the White Witch. Well, but who killed the White Witch? C.S. Lewis killed the White Witch. And so there's a way that the author can be involved and engaged in doing things within his story, and yet his characters be really active in that story. And that began to think like that might be how God's engaging with all sorts of things in this world he's made. And so from there, it's creation is communication, that God is, Edwards says, the world is filled with images of divine things. Images of divine things, pictures of spiritual realities. That's what the entire world is made up of. God revealing himself. Heavens declare the glory of God, and so does everything else. And so are we listening? Are we paying attention? Can we recognize him in all of these different ways that he reveals himself? And so that's a fun chapter. Lewis at one point says that every pleasure has the potential to be a tiny theophany. A theophany means revelation of God. Every pleasure can be a tiny theophany. And so that gets explored. Then jump from there to we're creatures. We're temporal, we live in time, we're bodily, we have bodies, we're not angels, and that God thinks that bodies and time are good ideas. And therefore, any guilt that we feel because we can't do everything all at once, or because we're bound in these bodies that need food and sleep and drink and all these other things, that's not a defect. God thinks that's good. And so kind of drawing on Genesis and trying to draw that out. And that God is the God of yes, that God says to Adam and Eve, eat from every tree. They're all for you. There's one no, but eat from every tree. And so he's a lavish God. He loves to give good gifts to his children. From there, it jumps to, the big question that emerges at that point is, well, what about the fall? What about sin? Doesn't that wreck stuff? And that's where we really it becomes, that's where it gets real, because most of us are very attuned to the danger of idolatry, at least in our circles, right? That we don't want to commit idolatry. And so how does the gospel deal with it? What is idolatry, and how does the gospel deal with it? And so there's a chapter on that. And then from there, it gets real practical. So there's this kind of deep foundation that just kind of sinks way down into salvation and the Trinity and sovereignty of God and revelation and all that kind of stuff. And then out of that, building on that, comes these chapters about rhythms of Godwardness. How do we, you say grace before the meal, and then you enjoy the meal. And then maybe you say thank you for the meal afterward too. But there's these rhythms to our lives where we go directly to God, and then we come back down and engage with horizontally with the world around us. And that God that's a divinely designed rhythm of we worship on the Lord's Day on Sunday, and then we live our lives during the week seeking to do kingdom things there. Then talk about culture. Does culture work the same way as creation? It's one thing to enjoy nature. Basically what happened was, as I was writing the book, all of my illustrations were either my children, my wife, or food. Mm-hmm. That's what I like. And so I began to think, like, one question people are going to ask is, what about movies? What about books? What about music? Can you enjoy those things in the way you're talking about to the glory of God? Does that work too? And so I have a chapter on culture that maybe we can get into. And then I give some illustrations and examples from my life, little snapshots. And then here's where the real fruit of being at Bethlehem came out. There's 3 chapters towards the end that were basically owing to the fact that I have Pastor John in my ear in a really good way. Because it'd be really easy to write a book about enjoying all the good gifts God richly provides us with everything to enjoy, and for people to hear that and think what you're talking about is health, wealth, prosperity stuff. That's what that sounds like. Enjoy all the good things. Just accumulate. Pull them in. Enjoy them, because it's all about God, right? It's just a way of enjoying God. And so I had things like, what about self-denial, ringing in my ears the entire time. I had conversations with Pastor John through the writing of the book, and he would say, what are you going to say when the baby dies? And I said, I hadn't thought about what I would say. I should think about that. So there were some really sweet things about being at this particular church, in this particular environment where self-denial, what about generosity? If you start talking about how you can enjoy your food, should you enjoy really, really fine food all the time because that's the best way to glorify God in the enjoyment of his gifts? What about generosity? What about missions? And so those kind of questions were front and center, and I knew I couldn't write a book about treasuring God by enjoying his gifts without addressing those. So I try to tackle self-denial and generosity and missions head on, and in the process, talk a little bit autobiographically about the ways that the wartime lifestyle, which all of you, I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with wartime. Life is war, therefore all of our resources should be strategically used. We should think about what's the front, where should we devote our resources, how do we send them to the front? And I had embraced that wartime lifestyle in college, and I think it went wrong in my heart. I think something goofy happened in there, something sinful happened, and the way that wartime was lived out for a number of years wasn't godly. It was actually sinful. Well-intentioned, I was trying to honor God, but it wasn't actually honoring to God. And so there's a chapter on that, and then a chapter on suffering and death. Like, what do you do if you're talking about how do we enjoy these things for God's sake? What do you do when they're taken away? And again, one of just the providential things that if I had to choose, I would say I'd rather not have this have happened. I mean, in other words, this was not something I would have chosen, but my dad died a year ago after about 7 years fighting Alzheimer's. And so kind of in the middle of this process, here's this man that I deeply love, and I'm losing him, and I'm watching him die. And then he dies in the middle of writing this book. And so it's like, okay, yeah, what it's not now the question wasn't mainly, what are you going to say to when the baby dies? It's, what are you going to say when your dad dies, Joe? What are you going to say about losing that precious gift? And it was really fruitful for me to have to answer that question for myself and to walk in suffering or through suffering with others in this church who've gone through things that are even worse than that, and to be able to say, God's still good in this, and you should press into the gifts and not, hold them at arm's length out of fear that that might be too painful if they get taken. And so that's so there's the overview.